It happened on September 3rd, 1260, a single day when the balance of power in the medieval world changed for good. A battle fought in the heart of the Holy Land, where an unstoppable empire finally met its match. And yet, most people today have no idea that this one battle in Israel decided how far the Mongol Empire would go. Just years before, the Mongols had swept across Asia like a storm. Kingdoms crumbled, cities burned, and no army dared stand in their way. But then, in a quiet valley in the land once known as Jerusalem, something completely unexpected happened. Welcome to Heroic History, your daily deep dive into the most incredible stories of ancient warfare. We're building a growing community of history lovers just like you. So if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so we can keep bringing these epic battles to life every single day. So how did the Mamluks outsmart the world's most feared army? Why did a single victory in Israel change the fate of 3 continents? And how did this one battle stop the Mongols from becoming a global empire? Let's find out. Let me take you back to the middle of the 13th century, a time when the world seemed to be burning from one end to the other. The Mongol Empire, forged by Genghis Khan and held together by his iron law code, known as the Yasa, had become a machine of global conquest. By the time his grandson, Mongol Khan, took power in 1251, the empire stretched from the shores of the Pacific Ocean all the way to the plains of Eastern Europe. It was the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen, covering about 9 million square miles, roughly 4 times the size of modern-day Europe. Mongol was not content with what his ancestors had already achieved. He wanted to bring the last independent civilizations of the known world under Mongol control, particularly the Islamic world. To carry out this grand design, he gave his brother Hulagu Khan a monumental mission to secure the western front of the empire, crush any remaining Muslim resistance, and extend Mongol power all the way to the Mediterranean. Historians call this campaign the Western Operation, and it would soon bring the heart of Islam face to face with its greatest nightmare. When Hulagu's armies rode into Mesopotamia in the 1250s, their advance looked unstoppable. They were said to number about 120,000 men, a massive force for the time, complete with engineers from China, Persian administrators, and even Christian auxiliaries from Georgia and Armenia. Their target was Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, the intellectual and spiritual capital of the Abbasid Caliphate for over 5 centuries. In early 1258, the Mongols laid siege to Baghdad. For 2 weeks, their siege engines rained stones and fired on the city's walls. Chroniclers describe the scene in horrific detail. The Tigris River ran black with ink as the Mongols dumped countless books from Baghdad's legendary libraries into the water. But either way, it was one of the worst massacres in medieval history. The last Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mustasim, was captured and executed, reportedly rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by Mongols. The psychological shock was immense. For Muslims across the Middle East, Baghdad's fall was not just a military defeat, it was a civilizational collapse. The city that had once been the center of learning, astronomy, and philosophy was now a graveyard, and it sent a chilling message to every ruler still standing: surrender and die anyway, or resist and maybe survive. That's why Cairo, the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, suddenly became more than just another city. It became the last fortress of Islam. The Mamluks themselves were fascinating people. They weren't born into power. Most of them had begun their lives as slaves, Turk boys from the Kipchak steppes north of the Black Sea, sold into servitude and trained from childhood to fight as elite cavalrymen. Over time, these soldiers became so skilled and loyal to one another that they overthrew their masters and built their own state. By the 1250s, Egypt was ruled by these Mamluk warrior elites, a kind of military meritocracy where power was earned on the battlefield, not inherited. And that made them different from every other enemy the Mongols had faced. The Mongols thrived on chaos. They exploited weak dynasties, corrupt officials, and infighting among nobles. But the Mamluks were disciplined, tightly organized, and trained to respond instantly to threats. They were, in effect, a professional army, led by men who had already survived slavery, war, and betrayal. When Hulagu sent his envoys to Cairo in 1260, demanding surrender, he probably expected the same result as everywhere else: fear, hesitation, and eventual submission. But Egypt's ruler, Sultan Qutuz, gave him a reply that shocked even the Mongols. Instead of negotiating, Qutuz ordered the Mongol envoys executed. Their severed heads were displayed above the city gates of Bab Zuila, Cairo's most famous entrance. Imagine that for a moment. The heads of Mongol messengers staring down from the walls of a city that refused to bow. It wasn't just defiance, it was psychological warfare. Qutuz knew exactly what he was doing. By killing those envoys, he destroyed any chance of internal dissent within his ranks. No Mamluk emir could now argue for compromise. The path of negotiation was gone. It was fight or die with no middle ground. Cairo's survival was at stake, but so was the entire idea of Muslim sovereignty. And in that moment, something remarkable happened. The Mamluks united. They understood that the fall of Baghdad was not just a story from another land. It was a warning, carved in blood. If Cairo fell, there would be no more Islamic centers left to defend. Here's where history takes one of its strangest turns. The kind of twist that makes you stop and wonder how much of history is shaped by human will and how much by pure chance. The Mongol Empire, which had stormed across continents for decades, didn't slow down because someone beat them in battle first. It slowed down because of a funeral. When Mongke Khan, the great Khan of the Mongols, died in 1259 during his campaign in southern China, the entire empire effectively hit the pause button. According to Mongol custom, whenever a great Khan died, a Kurultai, a grand council of nobles and princes, had to be held to elect his successor, and every Mongol prince of importance was expected to attend in person. It didn't matter if you were in Europe, Persia, or China. If you missed the Kurultai, your claim to legitimacy could be questioned. This was one of the hidden structural weaknesses of the Mongol system. For all their military genius and discipline, the Mongols still ran an empire based on family loyalty and personal allegiance rather than centralized bureaucracy. Their unity depended not on permanent institutions, but on the authority of a single ruler, the Great Khan. So when that ruler died, even their most successful conquests had to stop until a new one was chosen. It had happened before. When Ogade Khan, Genghis Khan's son and successor, died in 1241, the Mongol invasion of Europe came to an abrupt halt. The Mongols had already crushed the armies of Hungary and Poland, and nothing stood between them and Vienna. But then word arrived that Ugade was dead, and the leading generals, Batu, Subutai, and others, packed up their tents and went home. Europe was spared, not by its own strength, but by the demands of Mongol tradition, and nearly 20 years later, the same pattern repeated. When Mongke died, his brother Hulagu Khan, who was leading the Western campaign against the Islamic world, had to pull back the bulk of his army to return east. Estimates suggest he withdrew as many as 80 to 90% of his forces, tens of thousands of soldiers. What he left behind in Syria and the Levant was a smaller, though still formidable detachment of about 10,000 men under the command of his trusted general Kitbuka Noyan. Think about what that meant. Those 10,000 men were not raw recruits. They were veteran soldiers, battle-tested Mongol cavalry, and engineers supported by allies from Christian Armenia and the Kingdom of Georgia. Hulagu's decision to leave them behind was a calculated move to hold his western conquests until he could return. But the problem was, the Mongols were operating at the edge of their logistical limits. Their supply lines stretched thousands of miles, Even for the Mongols, masters of mobility and endurance, that was pushing the edge. When you imagine those 10,000 men sitting on the western frontier, think of them as being stranded at the end of a long, fragile rope. Every horse, every arrow, every ration had to come from far away. They were professional and confident, but isolated, and that's where the Mamluks saw their chance. Sultan Qautuz in Cairo realized that this was the one moment when the Mongol army in the west was both vulnerable and cut off from reinforcements. The numbers finally worked in the Mamluks' favor. Around 15,000 to 20,000 men in their own force against about 10,000 Mongols. For once, the odds weren't hopeless, but the key was timing. The opportunity wouldn't last long. If Qautuz delayed, Hulagu might return from the east with the full might of the Mongol horde, and Egypt's fate would be sealed. If Kabuka could hold out and crush the Mamluks before that, the Mongols would have secured a permanent base in Syria and could march south whenever they pleased. So Qautuz moved fast, gathering his troops, rallying his commanders, and marching out from Cairo toward Palestine. This is where cause and coincidence become intertwined. Yes, Monka's death created the window of opportunity. Without it, Hulagu's massive army might have overwhelmed everything from Aleppo to Cairo. But the death alone didn't stop the Mongols. It merely opened the door. It was Qautuz and Barbars who had the courage and skill to step through it. And even if Moni had lived, there's good reason to think Hulagu's campaign was already under strain. His armies were far from their supply bases, operating in a region scorched by desert heat and sparse in resources. Maintaining tens of thousands of men and horses required enormous logistical support. Fodder, food, water, spare mounts, and those lifelines stretched thin across hundreds of miles. The 10,000 men left behind under Kitbuka were in effect stationed at the outer edge of a military ecosystem already under stress. And afterward, the political cracks in the Mongol world only widened. The once unified empire splintered into 4 rival Khitates. The Golden Horde in the north, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Kate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. The heirs of Genghis Khan, once brothers in arms, became rivals locked in constant civil war. The Battle of Ain Jalut wasn't just another clash between 2 medieval armies. It was a military masterpiece. What happened that September morning in 1260 in the Jezreel Valley would mark the first true and lasting defeat of the Mongols, a force that had seemed unstoppable for nearly half a century. The Mamluk army was a purpose-built war machine, forged through years of training and shaped by a unique system known as Furua. The Furia was a comprehensive warrior code, a combination of physical mastery, mental discipline, and tactical intelligence. Every Mamluk soldier, most of whom had been brought to Egypt as Kipchak Turkish slaves from the Eurasian steppe, was trained from boyhood to become a master horseman, archer, and lancer. They learned to shoot accurately while galloping at full speed, to pivot and countercharge in tight formations, and to use both light and heavy cavalry tactics with precision. In effect, each Memla cavalryman was a hybrid, a mix between a Mongol-style horse archer and a European knight. They could skirmish from a distance with volleys of arrows, but when the time came, they could close in for hand-to-hand combat with lances and curved swords. This made them one of the few armies in the medieval world capable of matching the Mongols, not only in speed and mobility, but also in shock power. And there's an important cultural layer here too. Because the Mamluks were originally Kipchaks from the steppe, the same kind of environment that had produced the Mongols, they instinctively understood the psychology and tactics of steppe warfare. They knew the Mongols' tricks, the feigned retreats, the encirclements, the mass aerostorms meant to break morale before the real charge began. The Mamluks had seen it before, and they had trained for it. The Mamluks chose their battlefield carefully. Ain Jalut, known today as Mayan Harod in modern Israel, wasn't just any patch of land. It sat near a natural spring, surrounded by the gentle slopes and narrow confines of the Jezreel Valley. For the Mamluk commanders, it was a perfect trap. The valley's narrow shape meant the Mongols couldn't fully use their trademark mobility, the wide, sweeping cavalry maneuvers that had crushed so many armies before. Instead, they'd be forced into a tighter formation, their movement restricted, their tactics constrained. The date was September 3rd, 1260, 25th of Ramadan, 658 R in the Islamic calendar. The timing mattered. The Mongols had been on campaign all summer, pushing deep into territory they didn't fully control. Their horses, which were the heart and soul of Mongol warfare, were worn down from months of travel and battle. In contrast, the Mamluks were fighting on home ground, close to supply routes and fresh water. By choosing to fight near a spring, the Mamluks denied the Mongols easy access to rest and resupply, an invisible but crucial advantage that would tilt the balance. The Mamluks had two extraordinary leaders, Sultan Qutuz and his field commander Babaz. Qutuz, the Sultan of Egypt, was politically shrewd and psychologically fearless. When Hulagu's general Kitbuka sent Mongol envoys to demand surrender, Qutuz did something no other ruler had dared. He had them executed. Their heads were displayed above Cairo's Bobzua Gate, a place where the city's merchants and soldiers passed every day. It was a gruesome message, but a deliberate one. By doing this, Qutuz erased any possibility of peace talks or hesitation among his own emirs. There could be no debate, no fear, no faction arguing for compromise. This single act flipped the Mongols' greatest weapon, psychological warfare, on its head. For decades, the Mongols had used terror to win battles before they even began. Their reputation for total destruction, for annihilating entire cities, usually made their enemies surrender without a fight. But Qutuz's defiance showed the Muslim world that the spell could be broken. The message was simple. If fear was the Mongols' weapon, courage would be Egypt's shield. The Mamluks opened the battle with an aggressive charge. When the Mongols loosed their first waves of arrows at Ain Jalut, expecting panic and disarray, they found the Mamluk line still holding firm. Their armor, lamellar plates of steel and leather, absorbed the worst of the barrage. Their own horse archers fired back in organized volleys, hitting the Mongols with equal precision. This wasn't the usual script the Mongols were used to. They thrived on fear and chaos, on enemies who fled at the first sign of pressure. That's when the battle turned from a test of terror to a test of endurance, of discipline, reserves, and timing. The Mongols were fighting someone who could mirror their tactics and match their mobility. Suddenly, victory would depend not on shock and awe, but on command and control. The battle began to look like a familiar Mongol script. At least that's what Kitbuka must have thought. The Mamluks fell back quickly, a retreat that smelled like panic. To the Mongols, it was déjà vu. The enemy breaks, the pursuit begins, the slaughter follows. That's when the trap snapped shut. Hidden in the narrow valley ahead, Mamluki reserve units were waiting an ambush. The terrain, tight, sloping, and difficult for masked cavalry maneuvers, suddenly worked against the Mongols. As they charged deeper, the Mamluks swung around from both sides, closing the trap. When the Mamluks counterattacked, the Mongols found themselves fighting in a confined space where their horses couldn't wheel freely. Arrows flew thick through the air, and the Mongols, for the first time in decades, found themselves on the defensive. Still, the battle hung in the balance. The Mongols pushed back hard, their disciplined formations holding longer than anyone expected. For a moment, the Mamluk line wavered, and that's when something extraordinary happened. Sultan Qutuz, who had been overseeing the battle from the rear, saw his troops faltering. Instead of sending orders from a distance, he leapt into the fray himself in that decisive moment. Qutuz is said to have thrown off his helmet, shouted, "Oh, Islam!" and led the charge himself. Whether or not every detail is true, the symbolism mattered. It turned the fight from a battle of armies into a battle of wills. The Mamluks were no longer just defending their land. They were defending the last stronghold of their civilization. What could have been a rout turned into a rally. The Mamluks surged forward with renewed fury. In the chaos that followed, Kibuka, the Mongol commander, was surrounded and killed. His death wasn't just symbolic, it was strategically devastating. Mongol armies relied on tight coordination and a rigid chain of command. Once their general fell, communication broke down almost instantly. Without Kibuka, there was no one to organize a retreat or regroup the shattered formations. The Mongol line collapsed, and for the first time in living memory, their army was not just beaten, it was annihilated. In the centuries that followed, historians would call Ain Jalut the first time the Mongols were truly defeated in open battle. For decades, the Mongols had seemed like a force of nature, unstoppable, inevitable. But here, in this narrow valley by a humble spring, the illusion shattered. The Mamluks had done what no one else had managed. They had faced the storm head-on and lived to tell the tale. Here's the thing about the Battle of Ain Jalut. It didn't just happen because the Mongols got unlucky or distracted. It was the moment when a temporary political pause became a permanent military boundary. And that difference between coincidence and causation is what truly defines Ain Jalut's place in world history. Let's start with what some historians call the soft stop theory. According to this idea, the Mongol expansion into the Middle East didn't really end because of the Mamluks. It ended because the great Khan Mongke died in China. But there's a big problem with that logic. It assumes Kibuka couldn't have held the line or even captured Cairo before Hulagu returned. That's not so far-fetched. Remember, the Mongols had just wiped out Baghdad 2 years earlier. A city defended by nearly 60,000 men behind massive walls. Kibuka was a skilled commander with a proven record of siege warfare and terror tactics. If he had taken Cairo, even temporarily, the Mongols could have locked down Egypt and waited for reinforcements in 2 or 3 years. In other words, the soft stop theory ignores what was actually at stake on the battlefield. Now, the hard stop theory tells a different story. It argues that a Jalut wasn't just a lucky break. It was a decisive, irreversible defeat. Historically, the Mongols had an iron rule. If you beat them once, you'd better run because they always came back. They avenged every loss: Hungary in 1241, Shishya in 1227, Khwarizm in 1221. But after a Jalut, nothing. They never came back for Cairo. Not once. That alone tells you how deep this wound was. The victory at Ain Jalut didn't just stop an invasion, it transformed a temporary Mongol retreat into a permanent frontier. The Mamluk Sultanate now stood between the Mongols and the Mediterranean, forming a hostile, heavily armed barrier that would last for centuries. And then there was the psychological effect. For decades, Mongol power had been built not just on their armies, but on the myth of their invincibility. Entire cities surrendered without a fight, just to avoid annihilation. But after Ain Jalut, that myth cracked. The world learned that the Mongols could bleed, and that was something no one had dared to imagine before. But Ain Jalut's ripple effects went even further. It didn't just stop Mongol expansion, it accelerated Mongol fragmentation. After the battle, the Mongol Empire began to splinter from within. The death of Mongke had started the process politically, but a Jalut gave the different factions a reason to turn on each other. It became the casus belli, the trigger for the first full-scale Mongol civil war. The conflict between Burkhan of the Golden Horde and Hulagu of the Ilhanat. Burqa Khan, a Muslim convert, was outraged by Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad and his defeat at Ain Jalut. He saw both as divine punishment for Hulagu's arrogance and as justification for vengeance. Burke's Golden Horde attacked Hulagu's forces in the Caucasus, forcing him to divert men, supplies, and attention away from the Levant forever. That shift was fatal for the Mongols in the Middle East. Their empire was built on constant expansion, each conquest feeding the next, both in morale and in loot. Once the stream of plunder stopped, so did the machine. Ain Jalut marked the end of that cycle. The Ilkhanate suddenly faced economic shortages, internal disputes over dwindling spoils, and political infighting that tore it apart from within. So while the Kurultai might have started the Mongol slowdown, Ain Jalut locked it in place. It was the point of no return, the battle that turned an empire's pause into its permanent limit. The Mongols had conquered from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, but at Ain Jalut for the first time, they hit something they couldn't move. In the grand story of history, Ain Jalut was the turning point that shattered the Mongols' dream of a unified global empire. It kept the Islamic world from falling under Mongol domination, ensured the Mamluk Sultanate's survival as a powerful independent force, and in doing so, shielded Europe from an invasion that might have come from the south. From that point on, the Mongol dream of a single empire stretching across the known world was gone for good. Quietly died in the hills of Galilee. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the battles that changed history forever. Got thoughts on how close the Mongols came to conquering the world? Drop them down in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.